There are some pretty cool new features as well. For our instrument-rated friends listening to this podcast, one of the biggest things is you could never overlay a SID or a star on a moving map because they weren't drawn to scale. Jeppesen is now geo-referencing and drawing all SIDs and stars to a curved or planar form, which is geo-referenceable, meaning they can put it on the chart and your little blue plane goes up the SID or star. You do have to pay extra for Jeppesen charts on ForeFlight, or if you happen to buy Jeppesen charts for your Avidyne product, you get them for free on ForeFlight as well.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 94 of the Aviation News Talk podcast. I'm your host, Max Truscott, and you just heard Master CFI Gary Reeves. In a few minutes, I'll be sitting down with Gary to talk about ForeFlight. But first, if you're new to this show, well, we have a weekly news show that shares pilot safety tips and general aviation news and helps to connect you as part of a broader community of people that are championing general aviation around the world. And if you're enjoying the show, just click on the subscribe button on whatever app you're using to listen to the show. That way, new episodes will download automatically to your phone each week. And after the show, if you find yourself wanting just a little more of our aviation content, go on out to our Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome and click on the tab labeled Post. That's where I post news stories, and there's also a link to it in our show notes. And by the way, I've just posted a video I shot earlier today of a student pilot in a Cirrus SR20 handling some monstrous crosswinds at the Hayward Airport here in Northern California. So go ahead and check that out. And if you do feel that you're getting value from this show and you're also in a position to donate a few dollars a month, well, you can sign up to do that right there on the Patreon site. Again, that's at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Now here's our conversation with Gary Reeves. Now let me tell you a little bit about Gary Reeves. Gary has over 7,500 hours in over 50 different aircraft, including turboprop and turbofan, most of which is instruction given. He is a well-known popular national speaker on aviation safety, also a 3-time Master CFI, and he's an expert on using ForeFlight, single-pilot IFR, and GPS. Well, Gary, I'd like to officially welcome you to the Aviation News Talk podcast. I'm very excited to have you here.
Max, great to see you again. How are you been?
I've been great. Now, we were on the road together a lot. Tell folks where we kept bumping into each other this past year.
Well, we were both featured speakers at all of the AOPA fly-ins, and I got to be your opening act, essentially. I did a 3-hour mastering the IFR basics, and you followed it up with mastering GPS procedures.
And we had a great time.
Was a lot of fun.
So we're going to talk a little bit about ForeFlight today, and I'm guessing probably 100% of U.S. pilots are familiar with ForeFlight, but we probably have some student pilots and certainly some overseas listeners who may not know what it is. So just tell us, what is ForeFlight?
Well, ForeFlight is really the most popular version of what we call an electronic flight bag. So I'm sure you remember, and I certainly do, when I learned to fly, taping sectional charts together to plan across country and using the spinning slide rule called an E6B and calling for weather briefs and doing a paperweight and balance. And now many softwares do this all for you on an iPad or an Android. ForeFlight is the most popular. So it's a digital copy of charts with something called Geo Referencing. And Geo Referencing really means your position is represented on these electronic charts by a little blue moving airplane. So you can do your flight planning, you can get a weather briefing, and a bunch more, all faster and more accurately than you can with paper.
Yeah, and let's talk about, for people who don't know what paper is, tell folks what we used to have to do for charts, both sectionals and IFR charts.
It was always a challenge. I don't know if you ever had a flight on a Sunday to find an open pilot shop, or to find a pilot shop that had the current charts. IFR charts get replaced every 28 days. Sectional and Vfr paper maps get replaced every 6 months. So we'd have to go get the ones, make sure they were current, tape them together, use a long straight edge called a plotter, draw out a line, convert true headings to magnetic, and then do winds aloft and all these calculations. A simple VFR flight plan could be a 30-minute just working on paper charts.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember partner and I bought a Cessna T210 back in 2000, picked it up in Florida, brought it here, And before I left on that trip, I tried to scarf up every chart I could find the trip. We had about 40 pounds of instrument charts and sectionals, and there were still large sections that were missing. I remember thinking, wow, I sure hope we don't hit IFR in this part of Texas.
Oh, yeah. Or if you remember subscribing to Jeppesen charts, and they would mail you updates, and you'd have to take the old charts out of the binder and put the new charts in the binder as often as every 10 days. And it was just, I was never current. I was constantly 8 or 10 envelopes behind.
Yeah, no question. That happened to me all the time. So what are the different versions of ForeFlight that are available that an individual general aviation pilot might use, and roughly what do they cost?
Well, there are 3 current pricing levels to ForeFlight. The first one is called Basic Plus, and that's $100 a year. And I've seen a couple people on social media go, oh, $100 a year is a lot of money. Well, it's cheaper than buying just the VFR charts to stay current if you fly at all in a year, and they're instantly available. There's another version that most instrument-rated pilots go to, and it's called Pro Plus. That's $199, and it has some real significant advantages. Instead of being just geo-referenced on the moving maps, you actually get a geo-referenced or a little blue moving plane on instrument charts and taxi diagrams, in addition to something called Hazard Advisor. But really, the little blue moving plane going up the instrument charts is the significant safety upgrade in that level. I remember teaching many students, and even myself when I was learning, the instructor would say, okay, where are you now in relation to the localizer of the VOR? I have no idea. Well, it's pretty easy to know exactly where you are when you got the little blue moving plane. And then the version that I pay for is called Performance Plus, and that's $299 a year, but you get a much more detailed performance profile, meaning when ForeFlight does the wind calculations for me, and if I've accurately set up my plane, over a 3.5-hour flight, the fuel burn is accurate to 0.1 or 0.2 gallons to what ForeFlight said it would be. You get much more accurate time and fuel. And the coolest thing they have now is something called a pre-departure clearance and digital ATIS, which I'll talk about a little bit more later.
Yeah, and I just used that recently. We talked about that very briefly in a recent show. So my recollection is ForeFlight came out almost 10 years ago, soon after the iPhone came out. And that probably was version 1.0. What are we up to now?
Well, we're currently at 10. And one of the great things about ForeFlight, and one of the hardest things about being a ForeFlight expert, is these guys just never stop. They add new features, it seems like every 3 or 4 days sometimes. So they're always getting better. They're always adding new features. And they're even bringing some old features back that we really missed.
Kind of reminds me of a guy who's a G1000 expert.
Yeah, if I think it's Triscuit.
Triscotti was the
Triscotti, yes. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the challenge there is that the G1000 is different in different manufacturers' airplanes. So, Cirrus will have different features from Piper, from Cessna, and all that kind of stuff. So, anyway.
And same thing. Yeah, now they're up to what, the G3000? And
yep.
Yeah.
All kinds of fun. And let's see, strictly iOS for ForeFlight?
It really is. And a lot of people ask me, when is ForeFlight going to develop an Android version? And the answer is never. And it's not bias against Android. The problem is iOS is made by one manufacturer. Apple controls all iOS devices. So you can only buy an iPad or an iPhone. The problem software developers have with Android is you can buy a $23 Android software running device with no memory and no processor at Pick and Save, or you can buy a $1,000 Android tablet made by somebody like Samsung, which may be better performing, but you have no way of controlling the power of those devices. So it's very hard to develop a program when you have 3,000 different manufacturers.
And I don't know if that's the reason that it seems that most of the pilots I run into use iPhones because they want to use ForeFlight, but there does seem to be, a much larger percentage of pilots using iPhones than in the general public, where Android is the predominant phone.
Yeah, absolutely. And listen, my cousin is a vice president for Apple, and we really appreciate everyone going Apple.
Yeah. Indeed. And I should just mention for folks that are using Android and going, rats, there are lots of great programs available for Android. So, for example, Garmin Pilot is the one I'm most familiar with. I've used WingX in the past. Any others that come to mind for you?
I'm not an Android guy, so I don't know any off the top of my head besides the ones you've mentioned.
Yeah, I'm not an Android. I mean, I have one of those really cheap tablets that I got a long time ago just because I needed one time to get something that Android had. So let's talk about ForeFlight. So what would you say are some of the most common, most basic features that most pilots seem to know and use reasonably well? And then we'll get on to some of the lesser known stuff.
Well, I think there's probably maybe 5 common features that most people are pretty good at, and that's using the Vfr Maps. One of the nice things is when you zoom in and out on ForeFlight, assuming all your downloads are correct, is it seamlessly transitions from a WAC to a sectional to a terminal chart. So you're always on the current zoom, and most people are pretty good about doing the second part of that and making sure their updates are current. Now, ForeFlight makes it even easier that you can actually tell it to automatically download updates. But it's pretty obvious when there's a big number 4, red number 4 on your ForeFlight saying you need to download 4 updates. Graphical flight category is something most people are pretty good at. And that's just turning on one layer and looking at color-coded dots. Avidine actually kind of invented the glass panel, and they had blue for VFR and then green for marginal VFR.
And I'm going to just jump in because there was a glitch in our recording, but let me tell you that Gary was talking about the flight categories, and those essentially are dots that appear near airports with METARs that tell you what the flight conditions are, whether they're VFR or IFR. And essentially, you go to the Maps tab in ForeFlight, you go ahead and look at the different layers, and you turn on the flight category layer. And green dot represents VFR. Blue dot represents marginal VFR, which I think is going to be 3 to 5 miles of visibility and some clouds probably below 3,000 feet. Red is IFR, and then pink is low IFR, which is probably, although it's not specified in the ForeFlight manual, ceilings below 500 feet.
I think people are getting pretty good at looking at temporary flight restrictions and making sure that layer's on there and current. And then, there's a couple other things. Basic weather briefing, people are getting much better at that. Now, there's a couple others that people think they're good at, but they may not be necessarily doing it the right way. Most people will file a flight plan and then get a weather brief. Unfortunately, in my opinion, for IFR, that's actually the wrong way to do it. In IFR, you have to know if you need to file an alternate, which I always recommend you file 2, as in number of 2. You should always file 2 alternates, that's my opinion. But the problem is before you list an alternate, you need to know if that airport's suitable as an alternate. So what I'd like to recommend to all of your listeners is what I teach in my classes. You always get a weather brief, including your alternate airport, and then you decide to file. So I'd like to reverse, I think, the common way of doing it. Another way I'd like to change just a little bit is ForeFlight is so accurate as a GPS receiver. It's very, very good if you have an external GPS receiver or if you have it linked to a Garmin or an Avidine unit. I really like the Stratus series of external GPS receivers, but there are many. The problem is people drag or rubber band flight plans to go just outside a restricted area or just outside of a TFR. The problem being is the GPS position on ForeFlight is more accurate than center radars. Most people don't realize that centers like LA Center, Albuquerque Center, Salt Lake Center, their radar is pretty good to about a half mile of knowing where you are. So many people using ForeFlight will go 10 feet around the corner of a restricted area, and then FAA radar is painting them actually inside as a violator. In fact, TFR violations in Southern California increased so much because of people using handheld devices that the 3 local FSDOs were unable to keep up and write enough violation letters. So they've actually changed their procedure a little bit, where if you're only a little bit inside of a TFR and then immediately leave, they just assume you're using a handheld device. So the easiest way to avoid that is to stay a half mile outside of all restricted airspace or TFR and a minimum of 500 feet above or below. And then the last thing is the way people do IFR flight plans. Almost no controller, with the exception of the very large Bravo airspaces, actually wants you on a Victor airway. Most people don't want you on a Victor airway. In fact, if you file long cross countries on Victor airways, you'll always get amendments to your clearance. You'll get rerouted 3 or 4 times, and I'm sure that's happened to you. What's the most times, Max, you've been rerouted on one IFR trip?
Let me think about that. For sure, I get amendments most often when I'm going from Northern California to Southern California. I don't think I've ever had an IFR trip where I didn't get an amendment as soon as I started getting close to LA Center. But typically, 2 is pretty normal headed down that way. But I don't know. Well, you have a horror story on that?
No, it happens a lot, and it's because you're on the Victor or the jet routes. They always have to maintain a 3-mile separation around IFR traffic, but the problem is there's too many people on the Victor Airways, and whatever route you're on, you're always too slow for the guy behind you, or you're catching up to somebody else, and they're rerouting to avoid traffic jams and holds. The much better way is to always file a standard instrument departure, always fly a standard terminal arrival route, and GPS direct in between. Simply get off the Federal Airways. It's called unpublished RNAV, and every ATC controller will tell you they prefer that over you being on the Federal Airways. Or if you're going to somewhere where there is no star, I actually want you to file the SID out, or let's say there's no SID, no star at all. File to the nearest VOR after your departure in case we lose GPS, then file GPS direct to the initial approach fix of the approach you want to shoot when you get there. And I do that all over the country, and I get it every single time, and I never get reroutes.
And I find I get direct clearances all the time outside of California. Inside of California, I seem to always be getting IFR clearances along Victor Airways. So I'm wondering, will ForeFlight's Route Advisor offer direct routings, or am I just getting routed along airways in California because that's what's being suggested most of the time?
It's a great question, Max. That's actually not a route advisor. A lot of people think these are suggested routes that are preferred by air traffic control, and it's actually not true at all. It's simply a history of the last 3 or 4 people who got clearances. So it may not be the best route. You may not even be able to fly that route because they have different equipment. That's why I actually don't use that feature at all. Even though it's very helpful for new people, you're just looking at what other people have done.
Yeah, one of the nice features is that once you have a routing that you like for a common route that you fly often, you can just save it in ForeFlight and then use it every time you file.
Absolutely. And looking at other people's routes is a good way to compare, maybe they have a better shortcut or something. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I like being able to see which of those routes are being flown by jets, for example, versus pistons, because that'll give you a good idea which routes are going to be most appropriate for the airplane you're flying.
Absolutely. Now, I will tell you, anytime you get into busy Bravo airspace, here in Texas, we have what's called regional approach, which covers the DFW area. Of course, you have NorCal and they have SoCal, Newark, JFK, Boston. You really need to file the SIDs and stars because GPS direct will not get approved there because you're got in conflict with too many other federal airway routes. So you just make it worse. So file the SIDs and the stars and then go GPS direct in between.
So do you have any features that you think pilots probably don't know as well as they probably should?
Yeah, and I think the most common thing that people don't know yet is IFR flight plans are required to be done on the ICAO format now. And it's been that way for over a year, but the FAA is letting people do it anyway. The problem is that if you still file on FAA domestic flight plans, you will never get an RNAV or GPS-based SID or STAR. In fact, not only do you have to use the ICAO format, you actually have to set up your airplane correctly. And it's not simply slant gulf. There are many, many subsets that you have to do. You actually have to put in the Mode S base 16 code of your airplane off the FAA registration. And the typical FAA flight plan listed you as slant gulf, meaning you have GPS. The typical ICAO flight plan may have 18 to 20 letters as a suffix. You just need to know how to put all of those things in.
Oh, wow. And where do we go to find our Mode S code for a particular airplane we fly?
Well, it's pretty easy. You just go over to FAA.gov, search for your tail number, and you'll see a base 8 hex code and a base 16 hex code, and that's where you put it in. So I'll kind of walk through it here. If you open up ForeFlight and you click on the 3 dots or 4 dots that says More, and then you click Aircraft, and we'll open up mine. So I have a 1966 Cessna 206. ICAO equipment for me is Bravo Golf Romeo Sierra Zulu. ICAO surveillance is Bravo 1 Echo and Uniform 2. I have 6 different marks under ICAO PBN, which is performance-based nav. And then you have to touch other information and put in your code that you found on FAA.gov under the code. But then you also have to fill in the nav, the performance, and the surveillance data fields before you can actually get assigned RNAV, SIDS, or stars.
Boy, you got my head spinning there. That's great. And I agree. I think this is one of those features that I would probably learn to use a little better. So what are some of the other things you're running into that pilots aren't doing so well?
Well, it's not so much, it's not that they're not doing it well. I do have a way to make things a little bit better. I really like the ability to mark up instrument approach plates.
Yep.
Highlight the important stuff, put numbers in. So I always put in my altitudes in between each leg in much bigger font than Jeppesen publishes. I don't know about you, but I'm going to be 50 this year, and those little numbers on the Jeppesen seem to be getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So having a nice 144-point font makes my life a little bit easier. And this is what's weird. I really got ForeFlight to get away from paper charts, but I really recommend that everybody print out on paper the instrument approach plates to all 4 airports in every IFR flight plan. Of course, their departure, their destination, and both alternates, and mark them up as well. Because anything you write down twice stores in permanent memory, and it's easier to recall when you need to. And it's nice to have paper backups. I still think people should have paper backups for the critical phases of flight.
Well, of course, one common backup strategy I see around here is someone will have an iPad and then they'll also have an iPhone. And I remember one guy who, in addition, had an iPad mini as well, though he was an Apple employee. But anyway, having multiple devices as backup is certainly a great way to go, too.
Yeah, it's like my 206. I have 2 iPads, an iPhone, and Avidyne. I mean, my cup runneth over in electronic charts.
Yeah,
I still carry the paper.
Yep, and that's the way you want it to be. So any other features you think we could all be doing a better job on?
I think that's it. The biggest thing really is getting training. I think most really good pilots, most people that are smart don't realize there's a need for training. So Max, I actually learned when I first started training the G1000 from you. I bought your books. If you've obviously very experienced instructor, if I came to you and said, I'm a really good private pilot, I got my private pilot in 50 hours, and I'd like to rent your G1000, don't worry. I watched a couple YouTube videos and I read the first chapter of the operating handbook. Would you toss me the keys?
Probably not.
Because a G1000 is a complex system. Now, I offer GPS training videos. I have a series on the Garmin 430/530 that's about 4 hours long. My training videos on ForeFlight by the end of this month will be over 9 hours. ForeFlight is the most complex glass panel in any aircraft you're going to fly. No other glass panel system from anybody. Not Collins Proline, not Avidyne, not Universal, not Garmin can come anywhere close to all the features that ForeFlight puts in. And many people just don't know how to use 70% of it because they've never taken any professional training. So just like people should take training before they fly a G1000, I think they should take training before they use ForeFlight. And it can be as simple as watching their free videos and just reading the 386-page manual. Or, of course, I have other options.
Indeed. So I think it's kind of ironic that we have more complexity in the iPad than we have in the panel in the airplane. But I think what that's really done is it's allowed pilots who are flying older round gauge airplanes to get many of the features that they would have if they were flying a late model airplane.
Absolutely. I own a 1966-206 that has a lot of new toys in it. But before I put in all the new technology that I have, I already had most of it in ForeFlight. Live weather and traffic with a Stratus receiver. And what a great thing having a traffic advisory system in the airplane is. The only thing it did for me, though, when I first started flying with ForeFlight, is it actually made me more scared to go fly in Southern California, because before I didn't know there were that many people near me. And now I'm like, oh my God, there's somewhere everywhere. But it's not certified for primary navigation, and it never will be because any handheld device can't be by the FAA. But what a great emergency backup system.
Well, speaking of emergency backups, I always think, for example, about the synthetic vision feature that's available with ForeFlight. Talk about that and any other new features that may have come out in the last couple of years that pilots might not be familiar with if they haven't done recent training.
Well, to get the full synthetic vision, you do need a Stratus receiver or their new Scout. I'm sorry, not their new Scout, the new Sentry. I like the Stratus receivers best, although you can build your own called a StratX. I really like the Stratus from Apario. It's actually a full and complete attitude heading reference system that I do 3-day trainings for clients where I do 20 hours of very high intense IFR mastery training. And when they're the most exhausted at the end of the 3rd day, I turn off their entire panel and under the hood using ForeFlight and a Stratus only, make them either land the plane or get within 200 feet of the runway just using ForeFlight. If you can fly a glass panel airplane, you can fly a ForeFlight only airplane in an emergency. Couple big differences. It's not an indicated altitude, it's a GPS altitude. It's not an indicated airspeed, it's a ground speed. But if you fly your known power settings, you can absolutely get down safely in an emergency or buy a Cirrus and just pull the chute, which is always much better. There are some pretty cool new features as well. For our instrument-rated friends listening to this podcast, one of the biggest things is you could never overlay a SID or a star on a moving map because they weren't drawn to scale. Jeppesen is now geo referencing and drawing all SIDs and stars to a curved or planar form, which is geo-referenceable, meaning they can put it on the chart and your little blue plane goes up the SID or star. You do have to pay extra for Jeppesen charts on ForeFlight, or if you happen to buy Jeppesen charts for your Avidyne product, you get them for free on ForeFlight as well. And then the two newest things that I really love are a digital ATIS and a pre-departure clearance. Only available at about 70 airports right now, but you can actually get the true ATIS, not just a METAR. So you can actually get information Zulu with the current weather and all the local NOTAMs, what instrument approaches are in use, what taxiways are closed, everything straight on ForeFlight. But there's a catch. It is internet only, meaning it's not broadcast on the ADS-B or XM network. So if you're connected to a Scout, a Sentry, a Stratus, or an XM receiver, you won't get the digital ATIS. You have to have cellular data connecting to actually the ground-based internet. So you can get it before you go, or you can get it if you have an in-flight internet package. And the best part is that comes along with a pre-departure clearance. You actually get a full legal clearance. You never have to call clearance delivery. It's here's your clearance word for word with a transponder code. So you don't have to call clearance delivery. You don't have to listen to the ATIS at the big airports. And it's coming soon hopefully within the next couple of years, to all airports in the U.S. I don't know if you've ever been at a non-towered airport and you have to call for a clearance, and then they say, okay, you can take off in 10 minutes, and here's your void time. Now you get everything directly over the internet. And then the last feature that just came back, one of my favorite features off early versions of ForeFlight, which was deleted, we now have the ability to put your aircraft POH checklist back into ForeFlight. So checklists are back. And I think that's one of my favorite features of all time.
Yeah, and I used the PDC for the first time, the pre-departure clearance, probably mid to late December. Initially, we were trying to find just where in the ForeFlight app you get your clearance back to, and it was only later that we learned that it doesn't come back to you in the app, but instead comes as a text message and as an email. But what was intriguing to me was, since we couldn't initially find it because it was the first time that we'd used it, we called clearance delivery, and they said, oh, it's already been sent to you on PDC. So they know... They know that it's been sent to you that way.
Right. Yeah, it really is a neat thing. I think ForeFlight has just changed aviation more than any other product.
Well, as we start to wrap up here, any other key things that we haven't talked about that you'd like to mention about ForeFlight?
The biggest thing is get training so you know how to use it. Most pilots that I meet nationwide are really good at 20 to 30% of the program. They just don't know all the features, and they don't know how to use it correctly and quickly in an emergency. But they just know the basics. So I just like to encourage people to learn more about the program.
And where do people go to find out more about the online training that you offer for ForeFlight?
Well, they can simply go over to pilotsafety.org, and there's a couple free videos to get started. And I also have an 8.5-hour, soon-to-be 9-hour version that's either accessible online, or my favorite is a little bit archaic. I actually prefer the DVDs better. The DVDs are not designed to play on a laptop computer. Heck, my new MacBook doesn't even have a USB port, let alone a DVD player. They're designed for the old-fashioned DVD players. Did I really just say old-fashioned DVD? Wow, it's not like I said 8-track or anything, but a DVD player hooked up to a television, because what I'd like them to do is, it's a higher quality picture, watch me do something, and then they follow along on their iPad in front. And I also teach live ForeFlight classes all over the country, including one coming up in February 9th and 10th in Orlando, Florida, at a program called Aviation Mastery. And they can find all the details on that same website, pilotsafety.org, as well.
Gary, that is fantastic. You are a great asset for anybody interested in learning ForeFlight. I've learned a lot just sitting here. So thanks so much for coming on the show and for sharing all this information.
All right, Max. Well, I'll look forward to seeing you, and I'll catch up with you probably at the next AOPA.
Look forward to seeing you on the road. Take care, Gary.
Thanks, Max.
Well, Gary is really knowledgeable. If you ever get a chance to hear him speak about IFR or any other topics at one of the larger aviation shows around the country, you'll want to do that. And I've put a link to his pilotsafety.org website in our show notes. And hey, it's January in time for New Year's resolutions, and a lot of listeners must have resolved to buy a Cirrus in 2019, as I heard from a surprising number of people in the past week who are looking for pointers on buying either a new or used Cirrus. Now, the call is free, and I'm happy to talk with anyone who's thinking about buying a Cirrus, so if getting a new or used Cirrus is on your radar, please call me today at 650-967-2500, or go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page to send me an email. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the world. Also, please check out our Patreon site and consider making a New Year's resolution to support the Aviation News Talk podcast in 2019 and become a supporter of the show by donating a few dollars each month. You can do that by credit card at the Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And finally, please take just a few minutes today to tell just one friend about the Aviation News Talk podcast. And if he or she doesn't already listen to podcasts, and by the way, most people don't, just go ahead and send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store. Now, that's the same place you go to download any app, and download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast app for either iOS or for Android. To get the app, just go to the App Store for your phone and do a search for Aviation News Talk. And until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.